Welcome to the second series of these meditations in a time of uncertainty and lockdown. This time we're going to be looking at the Cloud of Unknowing, which was written at the same time as Julian of Norwich, again written in the Middle English, and it was written by an author we don't know who he was. We assume he was a priest because there's a priestly blessing at the end, and he may have been a Carthusian monk, because the Carthusians had a tradition and still have a tradition of writing their books anonymously. And the Cloud of Unknowing and other texts written by this author are all anonymous. But they were handed down in the monastic tradition, but there's no certainty that it was written for or by monks, because there's no mention of monastic life in the text. They are giving a spirituality for people seeking prayer, and specifically those seeking the solitary life. And that is why this text is also relevant to the time at the moment where we're having to live more enclosed. The text, The Cloud of Unknowing, was written for a young man, aged 24, who was seeking to live a solitary life. So all of us are having to face more solitude during this time. Again, I'm going to be using slides, so if you're patient a moment, I'll bring up the slides at the moment. So this series of 3 talks for half an hour each are entitled The Wisdom of Uncertainty, Getting into the Cloud of Unknowing. Now, the idea of this cloud of unknowing, which the author writes about, is that between us and God, between us and the experience of God, there is a cloud, so that we do not know God. We can't think about God, and this cloud also removes the images we have of God. We're used to, when you go into church, you see a lot of images, you hear a lot of words, and this is all ways of pointing us towards God. But this particular text is showing that there is an unknowing which we have to enter into to really encounter God. We have to enter into the cloud of unknowing. And this unknowing is something we're all living through at the moment in a time of uncertainty. It's not just God that we cannot understand, but life, everything that happens in life. And it's one of the mysteries that God comes to us disguised as our life. So we have to learn to live with uncertainty. It is part of learning to be with God. God doesn't give answers. God allows us to live fully, even in the uncertainty. And uncertainty is a path of wisdom. It's the knowing that nothing is permanent and that we can't know everything. We are only see part of the story. So this series of 3 talks on the wisdom of uncertainty, getting into the cloud of unknowing. These 3 talks I'll be giving, and we'll be looking at 6 chapters. The first talk will be looking at chapters 1 and 4. Second talk, chapters 5 and 6. And the third talk will look at chapters 7 and 9 of the Cloud of Unknowing. So if you want to refer to those chapters if you have a text or read them, then those are the ones I'll be using. Although I will be mentioning other chapters in part, especially at the end, just to give a sense of the whole book. There are actually 72 chapters in the Cloud of Unknowing, so I'm only dealing with these initial chapters, but these are the main ones. The latter chapters are all just kind of explaining bits in these chapters. So these are the main ones. I don't want to overload you, because this living in the time of unknowing, we have to let go of overthinking. So anyway, I've started with this cartoon. The woman is complaining, in here meditating all the time. Why do you have to be so thoughtless? So anyway, we'll start with this chapter 1. Right at the beginning, there's a prefix to the text, the Cloud of Unknowing. And it says, here begins a book of contemplation called the Cloud of Unknowing, in which a soul is made one with God. So right from the beginning, this is a book which sort of jumps in at the deep end of the Christian life, in which we're made one with God. It's not just thinking about God or praying to God or having devotion. This is the path of union, oneness with God. This is why it is a great mystical text. And the same author of the Cloud of Unknowing translated some of the classic mystical texts in the English tradition. So he was focusing on this deep end of the spiritual life. And then it says that this book is being written to someone who is able to live in solitude. Now, all of us are in the moment having to live in more solitude than usual. But there is a sense that the author says that we won't be able to come to this union with God unless we, in some sense, face the uniqueness of our being. We learn to live with ourselves and accept ourselves and love ourselves in order to realize that God is united to us. So the book is written as a treatise to a young man who's age 24 and is seeking a solitary life. This was very popular in the late Middle Ages. We've seen this is written at the same time as Julian of Norwich in the late 14th century. And this was a time when many people were seeking a more solitary life rather than being involved in a lot of church activity. And this is why these texts particularly speak to us today when we can no longer go to church, but we're living in our little cells of our homes, and we are living our meditation practice there. This is a copy of an early text. It's written in the Middle English, very similar to the same English as Julian of Norwich's text. It's got a different sort of dialect. There were dialects in England at the time, and this has a sort of Midlands dialect, whereas Julian had an East Anglian dialect. So it's somewhere in the middle of England, the author. And traditionally it was, because it was popular in monasteries, it was seen that the author was a monk. Here we have a picture on the left of St. Benedict actually contemplating God, but through a cloud. This idea that God, we experience God through a cloud. And so this picture was an early illustration of the text. This is the first word of the text is an opening prayer. God, unto whom all hearts are open and all desires known, inspire the meditations in this book. It's a phrase that actually came into the Book of Common Prayer as a collect. So this is a text which has been influential in the Anglican as well as the Catholic tradition. So after introducing this, he explains the experience of how people are drawn into this cloud of unknowing. So I'll just read these little bits from chapter 3. It's as if our usual prayer it sort of dries up. Our usual meditations on God, our prayers to God, our devotions tend to dry up, and we enter into this unknowing. He says, for in the beginning it is usual to feel nothing but a kind of darkness about your mind, or as it were, a cloud of unknowing. The author uses this imagery of darkness, and he translated Dionysius the Areopagite's famous book on the mystical theology, which speaks about the luminous, shining darkness of God. It's not a usual image. We tend to think of God as light, but there's a sense that God's beyond our understanding of. So in this sense, we have to go into the darkness. So we feel a kind of darkness about our mind, or as it were, a cloud of unknowing. He says, you will seem to know nothing and to feel nothing, except a naked intent towards God in the depth of your being. So in the time of this meditation practice, he's encouraging, we know nothing and feel nothing, except we're reaching out to God in the depth of our being. It's this reaching out from the depth of who we are to the depth of God, not any images or thoughts, but the depth of God's being. It says, try as you might, this darkness and this cloud will remain between you and your God. You will feel frustrated, he says, for your mind will be unable to grasp God and your heart will not relish the delight of his love. So we're led into this unknowing, and also we may not even get a sense of God's presence. But he says, but learn to be at home in this darkness. Be content to be there without knowing or feeling anything. Return to it as often as you can, letting your spirit cry out to him whom you love. Crying out to God, even without receiving anything, it seems at the time. So you might be, by this stage, thinking like this, I don't care, this chap sharing the cloud of unknowing here, I don't care what he says, I'm not going in there. And then certainly the cloud, some people can be put off reading the cloud of unknowing. It seems a little austere, and it seems for the kind of the deep, as I said, the deep end of the spiritual life, where we might not feel where we are, and most of us would like to reflect on God and have a sense of God's presence. So we might be put off by these early chapters, but he does encourage us to continue. Now, first, he, rather charming way, says, don't, when he speaks of a cloud, don't imagine a literal cloud between us and God, that somehow we'll start picturing clouds in our mind. It's partly the medieval mindset had a more concrete, they were used to concrete imagery. We tend to be used to more metaphors and abstractions in the modern way of thinking. So he makes this charming paragraph where he describes how we shouldn't take the cloud literally, but it's a beautiful description of English weather in this paragraph. How, anyway, do not suppose because I have spoken of darkness and of a cloud, I have in mind the clouds you see in an overcast sky, or the darkness of your house when your candle fails. These are little pictures of clouds and darkness, but he says, don't really think in terms of that. If I had, you could, with a little imagination, picture the summer skies breaking through the clouds, or a clear light brightening the dark winter. So you could have these pictures, but this isn't what I mean at all. So forget this nonsense. This is why it's very hard to make a talk like I'm doing now using pictures, because he says, forget these pictures. When I speak of darkness, he says, I mean absence of knowledge, in the same way as I have not said cloud, but cloud of unknowing, for it is a darkness of unknowing that lies between you and your God. So he's using darkness and unknowing as darkness as a metaphor, and the cloud is a metaphor. anyway, he did say that, but I thought I'd put in some pictures of English cloudscapes. John Constable is the great painter of clouds in the 18th century, early 19th century. He did these beautiful pictures of the British landscape where you see the wonderful alternation of light and darkness that comes with the clouds. This is Salisbury Cathedral. And something of the spirituality of the cloud can be seen here, how the cathedral reaches out through the clouds towards the light. In the same way as our spirit reaches out towards God through the cloud of unknowing. And sometimes there is this flash of light or rainbow where we do get the glimpse of God. But usually there's this cloud between us and God. This is a more John Constable, just a painting of clouds. That's the thing. That's the title. You see light and darkness in the clouds. Another Constable, a dramatic one. And one more. So now we come back to we've done what the cloud said we shouldn't do, which is to think of pictures of clouds, but it helps because it gives this sense of what he's trying to say, that between us and God there is a cloud of unknowing. In chapter 4, he explains this more clearly in terms of the human person and the way that the human person works. He says, try to understand this point. Rational creatures, such as humans and angels, maybe he means men and women, but I think it means humans and angels, possess two principal faculties, a knowing power and a loving power. So we have a capacity to know here on the left, and a capacity to love here on the right. And he's sort of weighing them on the scales here. But he decides in terms of love. He says that this capacity to love is the one where we connect with God much more than the capacity to know. For he says, no one can fully comprehend the uncreated God with their knowledge. We can't know God. But each one, in a different way, can grasp God fully through love. We can love God and we can grasp God. We can completely grasp God through love because God is love. So we have this capacity for oneness with God through our capacity to love, because that is God's nature in us. Whereas knowing is always going to keep us at a distance from God, because we can never know God fully, as we can love fully. So he decides on the side of love as the main faculty. We'll look into this in the second talk, where he goes into this in a bit more detail. He doesn't deny thought completely, as some commentators have tried to say, but he does see that love is the main faculty for union with God. He says, truly this is the unending miracle of love, that one loving person, through their love, can embrace God, whose being fills and transcends the entire creation. So the love in our hearts is able to embrace God, who is present everywhere. There's a greater capacity of human love. So he says, humanity was created to love, and everything else was created to make love possible. There's a beautiful line, a sort of line we could write above our desks in the morning, saying that we're created to love, and everything else happens in order to make love possible. And then he says, by the work of contemplative love, humanity will be healed. So there's a sort of wound in humanity, and that wound is healed as we learn how to love. We become whole people again. That, I don't know how that picture got in. Now, the last bit of chapter 4, he gives this how we can love, and he says that we must learn to love in completely, which means at all times. This can seem a little challenging, but he says the first step in this is to be aware of each moment, to be present. We can't, if love is natural to us in the sense that it's been given to us, we just have to be present and be ourselves in each moment. And this is a great wisdom that the Cloud gives us here in chapter 4 about being in the present moment. This is the way we live in, respond to uncertainty. We don't know the future, but now, if we dwell in the present moment, we can feel we are still fully alive without knowing what the future will be. So he says in chapter 4, be attentive to each atom of time and how you spend it. In the Middle Ages, they believed the smallest thing you could measure was the atom. So this is the smallest moment of time. And be aware of how you spend it. Nothing is more precious than this moment and now. God, the master of time, never gives the future. He gives only the present moment by moment. He gives us each moment. So to be aware of the moment now is the first step of learning how to love. You can't stop time because love involves being living with uncertainty. And before we went into this coronavirus, we knew what was happening around us, and we made our plans. But we've been led into this uncertainty now, where we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the near future. But we have to live with that. This tendency to try and avoid change and disruption is never going to relieve us from anxiety. The only way to relieve us is to be here and now, in the present moment. Time flies, so we have to learn to fly with time. So neither stopping time in order to go into the past or rushing ahead of the future. We learn to be here and now. The problem of stress and anxiety is a problem of the modern world. The Cloud author seems to understand this. The problem is that we get driven by time. Our agendas, our deadlines, our schedules, and we have to be at a certain place at a certain time. And this is as if time is bossing us around. So we're always in a rush to get things done at the right time, and we feel anxious about it. But actually, one of the gifts of this coronavirus time now is that time is a gift. It's given to us, and we don't need to rush to do anything because it was given to us. And the Cloud author says thus: this is the law of the created order. Time was made for us, and we were not made to run after time. It's the experience of like being in the bus. Instead of thinking about how you're going to get to when you're going to get to your destination, which is to be pressured by time, instead we realize that this moment you were given on the way to something is itself the destination. This is the gift being in the moment. The text is written partly and charmingly as a sort of dialogue between the author and this young man who he's writing to, and who in the author records his probable responses at these certain moments. And at this moment, he anticipates that the young man he's writing to will feel discouraged, that it's not possible to be present in every moment, which we would also feel it's difficult to do so. So the author records the response of this young man he's writing to. But now I see you are discouraged, and is saying to yourself, what am I to do? If all that he says is true, how am I to justify my past? I'm 24 years old, and until this moment I've scarcely noticed time at all. Scarcely noticed the atoms of time, he means there. Besides, I know very well that in the future, either through frailty or laziness, I will probably not be any more attentive to the present moment than I have been in my past. I'm completely discouraged. Please help me for the love of Jesus. So the young man feels he's not very good at this. He wasn't good at it in the past, and he's not noticing it every moment now, and he feels he won't. So he feels he's never going to get this. So he says, "Help me." And the book is written as a helpful treatise on various issues, and here he gives the help. Now, this dwelling in the present moment, the Cloud author gives a particular response to that, how to do it, which is a little different from mindfulness responses today. It's about a relationship to God through Jesus. He speaks of it sharing in the mind of Christ. The mindfulness we have is the presence of Christ within us. So he says, in love, all things are shared. So if you love Jesus, everything of his is yours. So that we, in our love of Jesus, we become able to live as he did. And he says that Jesus lived at every moment completely. That's as God, he was creator and dispenser of time. So he was never pressured by time because he created time. As man, he consciously mastered time. So he lived within time in a fully present way. And as God and man, he is the rightful judge of our usage of time. So he's the one who can guide us into mindfulness, to be close. So it's a sort of devotional response to mindfulness, that we can actually put on the mindfulness of Jesus in the same way as the Buddhists put on they take refuge in the enlightenment of the Buddha. They take on a mindfulness which is more than they're able to manage themselves, but it's given to them. And that's why living in the present moment is really a grace rather than an achievement. So he says, bind yourself to Jesus, therefore, in faith and love. This is the way he proposes to live the present moment. To have this sense of Jesus. If you're with Jesus, you'll never be outside the present moment, because he's never outside the present moment. So this love of Jesus, it's a Christian response, but it's one that can be helpful today. If mindfulness is seen too much as something we have to achieve, then it can we never really realize the gift that it's something that is given to us. As a medieval writer, he was also aware it's not just Jesus, in the sense that there's a lot of other helps in the spiritual world to help us to be in the present moment. He says first, Our Lady, St. Mary. She was also full of grace at every moment. To be close to her is to be full of grace, to receive grace at every moment. And the angels are unable to waste time, to be sensitive to live more with the angels. Will be in time responding, and all the blessed in heaven and on earth, all the holy people, through the grace of Jesus, employ every moment in love. So to be close to people who are blessed with this gift of love, we learn how to live each moment like a drop, and we fall into the ocean of the present moment, where the communion of the blessed guide us and into this fullness of love. So this is how each moment of time, each atom becomes a moment of love. So we're given this as a grace. This is Time magazine. different time anyway. But no one can claim, but he ends this chapter 4, which is what we're going to end with today on this talk. No one can claim true fellowship with them, with the blessed, however, unless they do all in their power, with the help of grace, to be mindful of time, each atom. So this practice of receiving mindfulness as a gift, it doesn't take away the fact that we have to practice ourselves. We have to do all in our power to be mindful. So there is a place for these practices of DIY mindfulness as well. So this mindfulness revolution has a place, but it's the Cloud author would say it would not be the whole story. There's a grace being given, not just our own efforts. So this is the end of today's talk, and we'll be, as I say, the next talk will be looking at chapter 5 and chapter 6, where we'll be looking particularly at the cloud of forgetting and the cloud of unknowing, which are very relevant for the uncertainty we're living through at the moment, where we are having to let go of things we know about this world and face a time of change. And then the last talk, I'll be looking at chapter 7 and 9, where he gives the advice on praying, taking a prayer word, a mantra. And this will be the third talk, where we look at that advice about how we can enter into the cloud of unknowing by a prayer word. So I shall stop the share. And so do keep an eye out. These talks will be coming out every week. So the next talk will be a week from today, around about. And in the meantime, if you want to find either online or in your libraries, Cloud of Unknowing, chapters 1 to 4, you can reread what we've been through today. And we'll continue next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.